Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Staten Island Forum on the Path to Ranked Choice Voting, the fourth virtual event in a five-part series bringing together policymakers, leaders from government, advocates, academics, and the media. I'm Zach Williams, staff reporter at City and State. Before we jump into our event, I'd like to thank our great sponsor, Spectrum, for helping us put together this great event. In lieu of applause, I'll just give a little bit of clapping on screen. It's an exciting time. This is the first year that the city is using ranked choice voting, which is already changing how candidates campaign for elective office across the city. We got a diverse group of experts to unpack how it all works and what it means moving forward as the 2021 mayoral race continues heating up. But before we get to their insights, Najee Roche, Director of State Government Affairs at Charter Communications, has a few things to say to help us set the mood.
Good afternoon, Zach. Thank you. It's definitely an honor to be a part of today's event. We've been having these conversations now for a few weeks, and I just want to say that every episode, as I've been calling them, has been a real learning experience just to hear about how our advocates are feeling about this, how our candidates for elected office are feeling about this. In particular, it's an honor to be here and on behalf of Charter, also known as Spectrum, as today's sponsor. We are in the business of making information available to people. We service our customers through connectivity through the internet, cable TV programming, and through everyone's favorite news stations like New York One. We play an essential role in making sure that New Yorkers are connected to the news that affects their city, that affects their lives, and of course, all of the players, the various players in the arenas that we all service. Now, we believe that it's critical to vibrant democracy that the public remain informed, and especially that's the case when we are talking about the electoral process and how they engage with that electoral process. As we all here know, but some of our viewers may not, in 2021, a new form of voting went into effect in New York City, ranked choice voting, and it's also known as instant runoff voting. Something the average New Yorker maybe not as familiar with as some of us here, but that's the point of these forums, is to get into the nitty gritty and help them understand what this means for their choices and for the leadership of their city in the months and years ahead. Now, like anything else that we do here, it can be controversial, but the benefit of this forum is that we get to exchange thoughts and information, and we hopefully get to educate our viewers a bit on how some of this will be unfolding in the time to come. Some of the questions we've been exploring over the last few months and that we're going to dive into today: how is this going to change the voting experience? How is it going to change how votes are tabulated? How will the campaigns themselves be impacted? Will there be, disadvantages, advantages? And Charter and City and State have put together what, we think has been an extraordinarily diverse and knowledgeable group of folks, candidates and advocates, like we said, to talk about all these elements and really bring this group together to get New Yorkers sort of on, if not the same page, at least a page. So for our part, we're so pleased to bring this discussion here, and especially for Staten Island. It is I think one of the most special parts of the city. And I always tell people that my first trip to Staten Island was a job interview after college, and I got lost, came off the ferry and made all the way wrong turn. There was no Uber or Lyft at that time to bail me out, so I just had to wander along the ferry area for a while. But we get lost a little bit along the way, and I got to learn about a part of the city that I'd never been to. So I hope to learn some more from our Staten Island crew today. And so I just want to say thanks to everyone for being here, and let's get this party started. Thanks, Zach.
Well, that is one way to set the mood. The Staten Island bottom line, not the forgotten borough today, that's for sure. But ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, this is complicated stuff, as Najee was saying. So luckily, we got the perfect guide, one of the few reporters out there that really knows the ins and outs of how this new voting system works and what it means for the 2021 Democratic primary for mayor, of course, the one and only, my colleague at City and State, Rebecca Lewis.
Thank you for that introduction, Zach. You're too kind. Ranked choice voting is one of my favorite topics to cover. I'm very excited to see it roll out in New York City. But obviously, there's a lot that voters need to be aware of, and hopefully everyone who's tuned in today will learn a little something about ranked choice voting and be a little bit more prepared once they head to the ballot box. So we're starting off today's event with a couple of mayoral interviews. We're going to start first with Dianne Morales, former nonprofit executive. Dianne, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks so much for having me.
So you were, I believe that earlier this year you got what was considered the first ranked choice voting endorsement from a
Yes.
state senator.
Yes, that's true. We did. Gustavo Rivera from the Bronx.
What was that like? I suppose we're starting to see more of them, but it was the first one. I think people were curious to see what that dynamic was like.
Yeah, it was interesting. Actually, what was most interesting was the immediate speculation that started happening after the announcement was made about whether or not we were creating an alliance or a coalition, or whether or not, of course, I was jockeying for a position in Scott's administration, because as the woman, of course, I must be looking for someone else to hire me. But in essence, I thought it was a great modeling, a great example of sort of modeling for the community what ranked choice voting provides, which is the opportunity to, not sort of to move away from this historic kind of like polarized dynamic where it's one or the other, and really get to choose more than one candidate and rank them in the order, hopefully of like what aligns with your values, and have more choice in electing a citywide representative.
Now, I think your website, and I apologize to any candidate if I'm missing anything on their websites. I believe, as far as I know, your website's one of the only ones that I've seen that's had a section dedicated to explaining ranked choice voting. What has education been like for you as a candidate on the campaign trail?
Well, I have to say that as excited as I am actually about the implementation and adoption of ranked choice voting in New York City, where we have failed is actually in the education of the electorate around what this means. I think, around language justice specifically, it can be a confusing process. And it can be an overwhelming one in particular, given this year, all the different, races that are taking place. And so, we have found ourselves, I think, and a lot of campaigns have found themselves in the position of feeling like they have to educate voters. So we started doing it a little bit last year in 2020. But earlier this year, we really ratcheted it up significantly. We've had a team of people that have gone through trainings of, from organizations that are experts in this, so that we can then turnkey that to the community, because we think it's an important part of people being able to really exercise their democratic rights. But the city's fallen short, I think, in terms of providing the education and the resources to folks across the board.
What do you want to see the city do better, do more of, as we gear up for June?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be an investment in education and outreach around this, whether we're using, community-based organizations to do that, whether we're sort of launching, advertisements and, an advertising campaign, a promotional campaign, whether we're supporting candidates with the resources to do that. I think there's a lot of different mechanisms that we could be using to make sure, and again, I'm going to emphasize the language justice issue, right? In people's native languages, so that they understand what is happening, as opposed to seeing this very complicated ballot on their, for the first time on primary day in June.
One of the other things that, is talked about with ranked choice voting is not just giving the voters more choice, but, changing the way the candidates campaign as well.
Yeah.
I'm curious if the new system has impacted your campaign and how you interact with voters, and, how you're going about trying to connect with voters in any way.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I've heard that come up a lot. And as someone who's never run a race before, it's hard for me to tell like how that's impacted the dynamics. And, personally, I feel like we're running our campaign the way we would run it, because it's in alignment with our values. And I don't necessarily believe in the idea that you have to, knock someone else down in order to lift yourself up. But I do, I do think it's been interesting hearing those conversations about sort of candidates kind of, being mindful of being someone else's second choice, or the possibility of being someone else's second choice, and how we, I guess, navigate that. It is interesting when I hear people talk about, she's my number two, right? It sort of makes you think about things a little bit differently. And, to the extent that it might make people be nicer, then so be it. I think that's a good thing.
And to wrap up, because we've run out of time for this short Q&A. I'd like to know if you've given any thought yet about who you might cross endorse among your candidates, among your fellow candidates.
Rebecca, that is like the $60 million question everybody wants to know. I think, so I think things are changing all the time and rapidly, and I think we still have a couple of months to go. So I'm looking forward to narrowing my own ballot choices as the field I think narrows. But I'm not quite sure on that yet.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us today and to talk a little bit about ranked choice voting.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great day.
Next up, we have our second mayoral candidate, Andrew Yang, an entrepreneur, and might know him from the presidential election last year. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to talk about one of my favorite things in the world, which is ranked choice voting.
It's a topic of great interest to me as well, so it's exciting to hear.
I just want to make clear too that my love for ranked choice voting predated like this particular race. I think it's just a better way of people getting to express their true preferences. Anyway, so just letting you know, like ranked choice voting in New York, yes, but I think it should be everywhere.
Well, you're just coming back from a ranked endorsement, right?
Well, a co-endorsement. I don't think they expressly said that. like I missed that part, Rebecca. But I do think that other organizations may want to take a page from the Freelancers Union, which co-endorsed me and Maya Wiley earlier today, is that if you have people who are excited about more than one candidate, and it is genuinely a ranked choice voting election, why not endorse more than one candidate? So I think that other orgs should really take a look at what the Freelancers Union did.
I'm curious now, just what turned you on to ranked choice voting to be such a fan of it, even before entering this race, before considering before passing New York City, I suppose.
So I was on the presidential trail, and I had an event with an activist named Lawrence Lessig, who some of you probably know. And he is fighting for various democracy reforms, including obviously trying to curb the influence of corporate money and like other things that make perfect sense. But one thing he was excited about was ranked choice voting. And so I read up on it, and I saw that it truly could help unlock a much more vibrant, dynamic, democratic process for us all. Because there's some really not great things about our current system. One is that there really is like a growing divide or polarization in many parts of the country. But another is that there are many environments where, frankly, the primary is the whole election. That's true in New York. We might not mind it so much because, we're all Democrats and like it's all. But in other parts of the country, like that, a lot of voters never really get to express their preference in a genuine way because the primary decides the whole thing. 80% of races are determined in the primary. So ranked choice voting would allow more people into the process. It should encourage more positive campaigning, with the thought process being if there are just two of you and you trash the other person, then you can drag their numbers down. But if there are 5 of you and you trash one other person, then that person looks bad, but you look kind of bad. And then the 3rd or 4th person like looks better. So at least in theory, like it should keep things more policy focused and positive.
What has education looked like for you as a candidate on the campaign trail as you interact with New Yorkers looking to make sure that they know what they're getting into in June?
Yeah, I do make comments all the time, Rebecca. Just yesterday, I ran into someone who was volunteering for another candidate, and I was like, "Hey, ranked choice voting, you can like still put me number 2." Like, and so I say things like that every chance I get, because I just love this process. I think it's so powerful. The fact is, there are a lot of times when you might be happy with 1 or 2 or 3 candidates, but you really can't stand that 4th candidate. so then you could just rank 1, 2, and 3 and then stop there. And I just think this is so much healthier. So I try and educate people every chance I get. I genuinely think New York City is lighting the way for the rest of the country. As usual, New York City ahead of the curve. Rest of the country hopefully will take a lesson from it.
What are your thoughts about how the city is rolling out education so far? Do you think the city's doing enough? Should it be doing more? Where do you want to see improvements?
You mean insofar as making people aware of ranked choice voting and the rest of it?
Yeah, like the educational efforts on the part of the city.
Yeah, I think we need to do more, truthfully. I mean, a lot of the times when I talk about it with people on the street, so that's why I appreciate what you all are doing today, Rebecca, at City and State. When I talk about it on the street, some people don't know what I'm talking about, honestly. So we just need to really exert ourselves to a higher level, get people more excited, firstly, just about the race in general, but then second about the process, ranked choice voting. And there should be fun infographics and mini videos and like different ways we're trying to get people information, because a lot of younger people in particular would be more likely to see something on TikTok than they might if it was, like a written print piece somewhere.
And lastly, before as we wrap up, same question for you as as the last one for Dianne. Have you given any thought about who you might campaign with, rank as your own number 2 in this race?
I'm not going to call out 3 candidates that I've grown to really like and admire. I think Catherine Garcia is a very, very, she's someone that we just owe a great deal. Very, very experienced city government and has delivered. I think that Maya Wiley has the best interest of the people at heart, and I was thrilled to be with her earlier today. She's just a very elevating human. And Sean Donovan also is very, very strong in terms of policy mind, and he's administered some very complex operations. So those are 3 candidates I would call out.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to talk a little bit about ranked choice voting. I do appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts.
You too, Rebecca. And hey, if I'm not your number 1, 2, 3, 4, just put me anywhere. It will all be to the good. That's the joy of ranked choice voting.
Well, thank you again for joining us. We're now going to move on to the main event, our panel discussion. Today, we are joined by Douglas Kellner. He is the co-chair of the New York City Board of Elections. Frank Morano, host of The Other Side of Midnight on 77 WABC, and Assembly member and Staten Island Democratic Party Chair, Michael Cusick. Thank you all for joining us today to talk a little bit about ranked choice voting.
Hi, Rebecca.
I want to first throw it to Doug and ask, you've got a couple of slides to share that were put together by the Campaign Finance Board, just to give people a little bit of a sense, anyone who's not super familiar with ranked choice voting yet, who has a couple questions about how it's all going to work, how it's going to look like. I'll throw it to you just to share your screen and let us take a look at what this process is going to look like.
Okay, well, thank you, Rebecca. So we have a new system here, which some people call instant runoff voting. You get to rank in 5 choices of the candidates. And here is an example. So you'll go down the column and pick 1 first choice candidate. If you want to make a second choice, you'll pick a second choice candidate, and then a third, fourth, and fifth choice candidate. This is what the last ballot from the Queen's special election looked like, with the actual names on the ballot. Staten Island doesn't have the East Asian languages added to the ballot, but your ballot will be similar, although a little bit more crowded, because you'll have separate contests for mayor, for public advocate, for controller, borough president, and city council. The ranked choice does not apply if there's going to be a primary for the civil court judge position in Staten Island, and it doesn't apply for any primaries for party district leader or judicial delegates. The key here is that you need to make only 1 mark for first choice. So this is an example of a ballot that will be voided because the voter here picked 2 first choice candidates. So that's a mistake that needs to be avoided. this is another potential error, if you call it a bullet vote. This ballot will still be counted because the voter voted all 5 choices for candidate B, but only the first choice counts. And you've basically wasted your second, third, fourth, and fifth choices by marking it for the same candidate. In counting the votes, the way the system works is that the candidate with the fewest first choice votes gets dropped off. So in this case, the candidate D only had 8% of the votes. Oh, actually, in this slide, they're illustrating that if you get more than half the votes as a first place choice, then there's no ranking and you win outright. And that's what happened in the first Queen's special election. All right, so here's an example of where the rankings come into play because candidate B got 39% of the vote, not enough to break the half threshold. So candidate D drops out and candidate D's votes, then all the first choices for candidate D will get redistributed. And you see here how they've been redistributed to the other 3 candidates. There's still nobody with 50%. So now candidate C gets dropped off and candidate C's votes get redistributed to A and B. In this particular example, nobody got more than 50% of the vote, but because A and B are the only candidates left, B wins and is elected. That's a quick example of how the process works. I think it's a great process. Voters will get used to it very quickly. And hopefully the media and the candidates will help educate the public, as well as the City Campaign Finance Board, which actually has the task and has gotten funding from the City Council to run a public relations and education campaign. And indeed, I thank them for the slides that I just used.
Thank you for that, for the presentation. I always like to start with just something brief to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that at least the basics are covered for how this is going to work. I want to throw the first question to you, Frank, because you reminded me about how you did, you testified at every Charter Revision Commission hearing in favor of ranked choice voting, and I just I want to hear from you, about why this system is the right one for New York City, and what you think New Yorkers should know about it.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate the opportunity. It's certainly great to be on a panel with my former Assemblyman, Mike Cusick, and somebody as well-versed in election law as Douglas Kellner. But I actually just looked at some notes. I've actually testified at all 6 charter revision commissions in New York City since 2002 in favor of ranked choice voting. And I believed in 2002 that this was the right system for New York City, but I believe even more fervently now that it's the right option for New York City. One of the few aspects that Mr. Yang and Ms. Morales didn't touch upon, and I think they're right on everything they said, is the potential cost savings for New York City taxpayers. New York City had a process, as you are aware, but some people may not be up on, where the top 2 vote getters in a primary, if no one got 40%, would have to face off against one another in a runoff. Now, in New York City, that means an enormous administrative cost, not only in terms of opening up all the voter booths and paying Board of Elections staff, which is millions of dollars. In some cases, as we saw in the 2013 runoff for public advocate, in a primary or a runoff that nobody bothers to show up in, But in New York City, we have the added financial drain of a second round of matching funds, which is now 8-1. So I think the cost saving is real. I think the fact that candidates are going to be a lot less likely to attack one another is real. I also think the spoiler effect, which we've seen in both general elections and primaries, is real and is totally avoided here. Every Republican that I know of loves to blame Ross Perot for electing Bill Clinton in 1992. So many Democrats that I know of love to blame Ralph Nader for electing George W. Bush in 2000. Now, putting aside whether or not either of those assertions are accurate, you do have this reluctance. You have this system that discourages people from voting for the candidate of their choice rather than the institutional candidate who's likely to win. My only regret with New York City's system of ranked choice voting is that so far it's only for primaries and specials. And I think it's going to be a lot simpler for voters to follow, and it's going to produce a lot more comprehensive results when one day it's implemented for the general election as well.
Now, I know that I've spoken to some candidates myself who were inspired to run because of ranked choice voting. They said that they weren't afraid of taking votes away from someone else who they liked, who's already in the race, and felt confident that it maybe gave them a better chance than if it was just a plurality system, because people be more likely to vote their conscience instead of vote what they thought would win.
Well, and let me just add on that note, right? In New York City, we've seen several instances of candidates almost getting elected who were opposed by the vast majority of the community. People may remember when Major Owens retired from Congress, David Yaskey, fine public servant, but a white public servant, was almost elected to represent a district which was overwhelmingly Black because there were 4 other candidates of color running. Now, obviously, I think if you asked the 70% of the people voting in that primary that selected a candidate of color, they would say that probably wouldn't have been their preference. In Queens, and I realize neither of these 2 races had ranked choice voting, but in Queens, in the recent election for district attorney, you nearly had Tiffany Caban elected, who was far more to the left of where most rank and file Democrats in Queens were. And had she gotten a couple of more votes counted in her direction, you would have had somebody elected who was opposed by 70% or so of Democrats in Queens. And these would have been results that were truly unrepresentative of not only where their communities were, but where the Democratic Party in those communities were. That won't happen with ranked choice voting. You'll have people being elected that are actually representative of the majority will of their constituents.
I want to go to the assembly member now in your own capacity as a lawmaker and the chair of the Democratic Party on Staten Island, about education efforts. Anything that you've been doing or the kind of outreach that you've been a part of to make sure that that the system goes smoothly and that voters are not confused when they go to the ballot box.
Right. Well, Rebecca, thank you for having me on this panel, this distinguished panel with my good friend Frank Morano and Doug Kellner, who I worked with when I was chair of the Election Law Committee up in Albany. This is a stellar panel. I don't know how I got on it, but thank you for allowing me on this. I just want to say, I'm excited, but also a little concerned about ranked choice voting because it's new, right? And we're going into new territory. But I got to tell you, I already like it because I can tell multiple candidates that I'm voting for them, and I'm not lying. And I think that's the greatest thing so far about ranked choice voting. But the education part of this is very important. And as a party, we're doing our best. I know that a number of our clubs and the organizations on Staten Island, I believe there's one tonight, actually. Move Forward Staten Island, I believe, is having one. I know that our district leader in the 63rd, Bianca Rajprasad, and Assemblyman Charles Fall had a seminar on it last week. We are trying our best because we think education is the most important part of this, because I know that being an elected official, I also understand that the electorate doesn't concentrate really on the election until the day of, or in this case with early voting, 2 weeks before or so. So a lot of folks are going to get there I'm fearing, and see this ballot and just not know what to do, right? So the education piece is very important. The party and the elected officials on Staten Island are doing our best, and will continue right up until the primaries start. But it is going to be a very important part of it, and we'll work with the Board of Elections and other community groups because we want this to work. I mean, in the last couple of the last 2 years now, it's been exciting to vote, and Staten Islanders have grasped onto these new innovative ways that we have now putting forward. We had huge turnout for early voting out here on Staten Island. People use the mail-in ballots, and I think people are going to be excited about ranked choice voting. So yes, there's going to be a lot of legwork beforehand in educating the electorate and making sure that people feel comfortable in doing it.
I think that there was a poll that recently came out that raised some alarm bells that you had a lot of the electorate who still had not heard about or were familiar with ranked choice voting. And I'll throw this out to anyone who really wants to answer. But the city is doing what it's doing. We've had 2 ranked choice voting special elections so far. We're still kind of waiting to see exactly what we can learn from those. But what are some ways that you think aren't being utilized right now that could be utilized, whether by the city, by the CFB, by candidates, by clubs, whatever it may be, to make sure that the greatest number of people are getting reached with information about this?
Well, I'll just add that I went back recently and read some of the campaign material from the ballot question in New York City in 1933. And in 1933, what happened was there was a proposal on the ballot to switch New York City's election for a board of aldermen with one person, one vote, single member district plurality districts, to a new city council elected through proportional representation. And what was striking to me about reading the vote no material and the speeches of those that were advocating a no vote is they were almost exactly the same arguments that people are making today against ranked choice voting. They were saying it's too confusing, saying voters couldn't follow it. They were saying they wouldn't put their ballots together accurately. Lo and behold, New Yorkers did vote for it, and there was not pandemic confusion the following year because all of the candidates running had a vested interest in explaining every detail of the process adequately. So I think what you're going to see this year is the 20 or 30 candidates running for mayor, the dozen or so candidates running for controller, all the candidates running for borough president and city council. They are all going to be using a substantial amount of their resources, which includes 8-to-1 matching funds and the video voter guide, explaining to voters exactly how to do this. It's not a difficult concept for voters to understand from an operational perspective. The motto of the Charter Revision Commission was as simple as 1, 2, 3. How do you explain ranked choice voting? I say to voters, just rank your choices. So I think the fact that all these candidates are going to be doing this amount of outreach is going to be extraordinarily helpful. I think we all need to realize that electoral reform issues are not going to galvanize the attention and the interest of both the media and the public the way, say, a debate over the war in Iraq would, or a politician's sex scandal or something like that. There are just some red meat issues that the media are likely to feature more prominently because they're more clickbaity, obviously the notable exceptions being City and State and Spectrum. But I think the fact that the candidates are going to be doing all this outreach is going to be extraordinarily helpful.
I'm just, before we move on, just wondering, Assemblymember Douglas, if you have any thoughts about, what you want to see, what more you want to be seeing, where you think there might be some maybe some holes in the educational outreach that you'd suggest to anyone who's trying to educate could consider.
I think you'll see that as we get closer to Election Day, as Assemblyman Cusick pointed out, that there will be much more engagement on explaining ranked choice voting. One of the things that I've noticed is that most of the Democratic clubs have only endorsed a single candidate. And that makes sense at this stage where they're really deciding who to put on their club petitions. And petitioning started this week and ends March 25th, I believe. And once petitioning is finished and we know who's actually going to be on the ballot, I would certainly urge the clubs to make a full slate endorsement. As Frank mentioned before, you have a second choice, a third choice, a fourth choice, and a fifth choice. And I think the clubs ought to get involved in that process and make endorsements for second, third, fourth, and fifth choices. And we'll see if that happens before June.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Doug's comments, I think that back to my point about people being focused on elections, I think that the education piece, yes, certainly should start if it hasn't started already, but I think it could be ramped up as we get closer to the election well, now with early voting 2 weeks before election day. So that a month or so before, I think, organizations can start ramping up the education. I don't think we're behind yet, because again, I don't think the electorate is focused on it as of right now, but they're getting there.
Something specific to Staten Island, perhaps not specific, but I think perhaps would be more of something to think about than some of the other boroughs. Is that Staten Island does have a significant share of Republicans, and a lot of the conversation is focused around Democratic primaries, Democratic clubs getting out information, and Democratic candidates educating people. I'm just curious, to the extent, to anyone who has any knowledge, I suppose, about any differences there might be for getting this information out to Republican voters and among Republican candidates, to make sure that when they're out campaigning for their own primaries, that people are aware. Just because, as I said, I think that this is a conversation dominated a lot by the fact that New York City is such a Democratic city that sometimes the Republican primaries can get a little overlooked.
Well, I'm not sure there's that much of a different formula among Republican constituencies than Democratic constituencies in terms of education. It's going to be very interesting this year. There are going to be at least two very competitive primaries on the Republican side, one for city council and one for borough president, in which ranked choice voting is going to be at play. I know several of the candidates running in both races and people working on their campaigns. And so far, I haven't seen much education from the part of the campaigns about how ranked choice voting is going to work. I imagine that'll come after petitioning as we get closer to ranked choice voting. I do see a little bit of a reluctance, which is, I think, the whole crux of the civility argument behind ranked choice voting, to criticize other campaigns. I mean, you have several candidates running in both of these districts that are not exactly known for being shrinking violets and shying away from a fight. And yet, in both of these races, the borough president's race and the Mid-Island City Council race, I haven't seen any of these candidates go overtly on the attack, attacking their opponent, which, if you compare that to the last time we had Republican primaries for any office, be it Congress, City Council, whatever the case may be, there were really quite vicious attacks. So I think ranked choice voting may already be doing its job in terms of civilizing the candidates running in ranked choice voting elections.
I think that's very interesting to hear about, certainly because that's been touted as one of the advantages of ranked choice voting, friendlier campaigning, less ad hominem attacks. So I think that those races will definitely be very interesting from what you're saying in these early stages, and seeing how they ramp up. Doug, I wanted to throw a question to you. I think we've got some questions about I suppose timing of elections now with ranked choice voting. I think there are people who are concerned about wait times. Could you explain a little bit about what voters should expect after the election, and what, I guess, just the time frame that they should expect to really have definitive results, if there aren't any definitive results on election night?
Well, right now, if there's any fair criticism of ranked choice voting, it's in the counting process and how long it will take to get a winner. And some of the decisions that the City Board of Elections has made so far have not helped in that process. The current plan that the City Board has announced is that they will provide election night returns unofficially that show the first choices that are made of the voters who vote in person on election day and who vote in person at early voting. If there are a substantial number of absentee ballots, those will not be counted until later. Then the current policy of the City Board, which is happening right now with the pending count of their last special election, is to wait until the last absentee ballot has been received before actually doing the transfers. That's not how it has to be done, but that's a decision that they've made. And the timing in New York can that it can be as much as 3 weeks after the election before the last absentee ballot that's eligible has been received. And for the special election that was held more than 2 weeks ago, Friday is the last day for the right to cure defective absentee ballots to be delivered to the board. And even though there are only 7 of those curable absentee ballots, the board made a decision that they're not going to start doing the transfers for that special election until next Tuesday. So I wouldn't do it that way, but and I have talked to some of the commissioners, but that's the current plan. Now, for the time being, for these special elections, the board has to count by hand, which is manageable because of it's only a couple thousand ballots. But hopefully the software for counting these ballots automatically will be approved at the end of April or early May. And so there will be computer transfers of the for the final counts, and that will show each round. And indeed, it would be logistically difficult and very challenging if we had to do a hand count for the citywide contests in June.
Well, certainly glad that that's not going to be the case with the software getting approved soon. And I think the big takeaway here is patience is a virtue, and you might have to wait a little while longer than you have in the past for these results to come in, unfortunately. But it's once they're in, you'll have plenty of data to look through and hopefully be more confident with whoever the winner is. Assemblymember, I wanted to ask you about, in terms of, educational outreach, especially. I think that one of the big concerns is, reaching voters who perhaps don't have internet access, voters who live in public housing, voters who are traditionally a little bit harder to get in touch with. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about best ways and best practices to reach sometimes hard to reach voters to make sure that they're not disenfranchised and are aware of these changes coming.
Yes, that is a concern that we all have, not only as a party on Staten Island, but the elected officials and the candidates have. Is there is on Staten Island, a large amount of the people who do vote, particularly in primaries, are your senior citizens, right? And so many senior citizens may not be hooked up to the internet or savvy on the computer, to that they get the information that is readily available with social media or any of the other electronic means. So there is going to have to be, and we're talking about it in our party, of a just a old school campaign of knocking on doors and getting word out there. I'm sure, as Frank alluded to, we're going to encourage our candidates to mail to folks and to contact folks who otherwise wouldn't be aware of these notifications in their ordinary course of business when it comes to campaigning. That part of the campaign process should be to let them know how ranked choice voting works. So we're again, this being a new concept, we're finding new ways, and we're talking to people on all parts of the spectrum, Board of Election folks and campaign folks and professional people who do campaigns, to figure out a way that we can get to people who may not otherwise get the information electronically. But it is a major concern.
Looking at, obviously the system was something that was approved in 2019. That's not going to change. There have been attempts to at least pause it, a lawsuit that, was ultimately not successful. It's going forward. But 2019 obviously was a pretty low turnout, low information election, and there might be people who don't really know about ranked choice voting too much yet. And just, I want to give each of you an opportunity to talk a little bit about, the biggest benefits in your eyes. I know, Frank, you touched on this yourself at the beginning, but the biggest thing for each of you that you think that voters should know in terms of why the system is going to work, and why it's right for New York City, and how it's going to benefit them as a voter.
Well, I'll begin in that I think it benefits voters in that you end up with elected officials that are much more representative of the community than this current first past the post system. Now, I remember when we had the special election for New York City Public Advocate recently, there was one major Republican running, and then there were 6 or 7 Democrats. And there was a conceivable scenario in which that Republican would slip in with a plurality of the vote. And at the very first forum in that public advocates race, all the candidates were asked, do you support ranked choice voting? And the Republican said, yes, but not for this election. And he laughed, and everyone else laughed because everybody knew what he was trying to say, which is that there was a scenario in which a guy that was opposed by 70 to 75% of New Yorkers could end up representing them. Now, that's crazy. Makes no sense. So only in a ranked choice voting system do we truly get elected officials that are representative of the majority. Is it going to be a perfect system? No, I'm yet to discover a perfect system. But I think if you look at the problems with the current system, and I'm sure there'll be growing pains, whether it's software related, as Mr. Kellner alluded to, or confusion in some quarters, or difficulties with endorsements or things like that. Look, there's going to be some growing pains, as there are in any system, but I think this will be a far more beneficial system in actually having elected officials that are representative of the constituents that they're seeking to represent.
Yeah, I'm excited about it because I'll be honest, when I first heard about it, I did not know what ranked choice voting was, right? And I'm learning as we go along, like everybody else. I do think that I would point out to voters that I do think that it's better than the old system, right? Again, when we had when people didn't meet the threshold, we had a runoff 2 weeks after the election, which one cost the city, and I'm talking as a legislator here, cost the city money. It also confused people, I think. This way, it's one straight up election where people are able to vote for who they want, and they don't have the confusion of have to coming back in 2 weeks or that type of issue. And also to Frank's point too, I believe, you know, we're early in the campaign season, but there is a different atmosphere, I think. You know, I think there are folks who are not, I don't see the attacks yet. You know, I don't see people, you know, going after each other yet. I mean, for, you know, one example we have a primary in the North Shore of Staten Island. There are right now, as of today, 12 candidates, right? I don't think you would have had that many candidates, you know, in the old system. And I believe it's because people think they have a chance because of ranked choice voting. It gives people a shot. You know, I'm not fully there yet, but I am enthusiastic about it because I think it can only help our system going forward.
Just before we move on, just want to, Doug, if you have anything to add that hasn't already been said.
No, I think that's, I support that concept as well. I think that it will change the whole dynamic of our primary contests for the better.
You know, one of the main criticisms so far has really been to do with the rollout itself of the education and making sure that people are aware of, you know, these changes. Is how much of a valid concern is that? You know, if you are someone, let's say, who the city doesn't reach out to, you haven't interacted with a candidate, you fall through the cracks, or, you know, you're not aware of it, you know, how much of an issue is it if a voter goes in and doesn't know that they have the option to vote and sees a totally foreign looking ballot when they go to vote? And what can be done? Perhaps, you know, what should we be thinking about in terms of poll worker education to make sure that in the case something like that happens, that there's at least minimal resources for that person to be able to ask, hey, what's going on?
Well, look, I don't think anybody would argue that there can be more done in terms of education. I think some of the criticism, and I think people know I've been as critical when necessary of the Board of Elections than anybody, but I think some of the criticism of the Board of Elections and the Campaign Finance Board in terms of awareness campaigns is a little bit misplaced and a little bit unfair. Almost immediately after the presidential election, the Board of Elections began rolling out a plan for education campaigns, and as did the Campaign Finance Board. Now, if they were to have started that before the presidential election, with all the unique issues related to the presidential election, and they started talking about ranked choice voting in October and August and even November, I think that would have caused even more confusion in the 2020 election. So I think, you know, there's still 3 months to go before the primary. I think you are going to see a lot more discussion on the part of public awareness campaigns. There's nobody that thinks that we couldn't be doing more to educate New Yorkers when it comes to civic affairs. I would pull my hair out of my head during the Constitutional Convention debates in 2017, listening to two people who clearly had no idea what they were voting on, debate the merits of whether people should vote yes or no on this issue. I think what you're pointing to is a broader concern about New Yorkers not knowing enough about the actual questions they're voting on, whether it's ranked choice voting or this one. But at the bottom line, upwards of 70% of New Yorkers believed they knew enough about ranked choice voting in 2019 in order to vote yes on it. So I think it's, I think we can't just say, well, you know, maybe we should disregard the will of the electorate, as the people that filed that lawsuit indicated. I think you're going to see more public awareness campaigns. There are definitely some things to figure out. I have some questions, certainly, about how various aspects of this will work. But I really do think that the linchpin in this is going to be the local political clubs, and even more so the candidates. They all have an interest in explaining this process to voters, and I think they will.
You know, Doug, just on the question of, I guess, poll worker training, you know, what what kind of changes do you think perhaps should be made, or just in terms of making sure that the poll workers are as informed as they can be to make sure that if someone comes in with questions who's unsure, that they're not getting any bad information at the actual polling sites?
Well, training poll workers is perhaps the core challenge of the Board of Elections. You have 35,000 poll workers who only do this a couple of days each year, and the election law gets more and more complicated every year. And so training those 35,000 people is a tremendous challenge. But the city board is certainly aware of that challenge. And as much as I criticize them all the time on this particular issue, they have incorporated ranked choice voting into their poll worker training programs. And I think that they're going to try very hard to address that issue.
And I would just add, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but during the two recent city council special elections, there were not reports that poll workers were giving folks inaccurate information. There were not reports that voters had nobody to turn to in terms of how to figure these out. So I think in the dress rehearsal that we've had in the Bronx special election and the Queens special election, the Board of Elections, poll workers, and the city staff, they've performed pretty well.
I also want to ask a question of, there's always a concern about, not reaching the right number of voters, of having voters who aren't aware of this. I suppose what is the acceptable, I suppose, to try to phrase it this way, the acceptable number of confused voters, I suppose, that will be inevitable no matter what, with any kind of change, whether that was last year with the rollout of pretty much universal absentee voting, whether it was the rollout of early voting, any change, whether years ago, the elimination of the lever system, of the levers, and introducing the scanners. Any change is going to take some time, and there are going to be some people that it takes longer for them to get a grasp of. This first time around, I suppose, what should we be expecting, and what might be too much in terms of voters who don't get it yet? What do you think the acceptable amount is for any sort of change, and at what point do you think that threshold is too much and really shows that we've messed up, that something went wrong along the lines, and that voters really didn't get it?
Well, I'll begin then, in that when Assemblyman Cusick was the chairman of the Election Law Committee, they combined they moved the primary to June from September, and there was all sorts of complaints that at the time that this was going to lead to confusion when it came to petitioning and primaries. And there was some confusion. And as you point out, whether it's the conversion to optical scanners from lever machines, or early voting, or universal absentee voting, there's always some confusion. I think the acceptable level of confusion among voters is zero. Right? There should be no baked in, oh, we're acknowledging that 8% of the folks voting are not going to, understand what we're doing, which I think goes to show why what you're doing, Rebecca, and what city and state is doing is so important, and while we all need to do more. I think when alarm bells go off, where we might say we messed up in implementing or rushing a certain system or laying it out in the manner in which we did, is when the number of voided ballots exceeds the margin of victory in certain races. If you had a council race or a borough president's race where the number of voided ballots, because they voted for 4 or 5 candidates as their first choice votes, if that number of ballots exceeded the margin of victory for a candidate that won, then it puts us in a position to call those election results into account. Hopefully a nightmare scenario like that doesn't happen, because hopefully we'll all continue to do more to inform New Yorkers about it being as simple as 1, 2, 3.
You know, and Assembly Member, I do want to get some insight from you. You know, as Frank just pointed out when you were chair of the Elections Committee, that there were some major changes implemented. You know, what did you have in mind when thinking about the changes and ways to minimize voter confusion? I know it wasn't necessarily your job to educate the voters, but you know, it's something that I'm sure you were very conscious of, especially since it was a reform meant to make it less confusing ultimately
Right.
by having a consolidated primary day.
Well, I find that with legislation, when it's first implemented, when it becomes a law and it's first implemented, you're always going to get some confusion, right? Because anything new that people are not used to, they're going to be confused. I think Frank is right. I mean, the acceptable number for confusion is 0 to shoot for. But I do think whenever you change anything, because this is for a lot of folks, particularly on Staten Island, you have regular voters, right? These are folks who vote every year, and particularly if they're voting in a primary, they vote in every election, right? So they vote every year. They're used to it. It just took some of my neighbors to get used to not pressing a lever, right? Just a couple of elections ago. So a lot of it, I think, is just habit that people are used to, and they're just. And I think, listen, we're going to have hiccups, like anything. We had hiccups with early voting. We had hiccups with the mail-in ballots. There are going to be hiccups, but I do think that yes, when you try to change a system for the good and for more efficient way of allowing people the opportunity to vote, it really is worth the chance that there will be some confusion at the offset. And I think, many of us, again, we're shooting for 0, but many of us are ready to explain for people what they have to do, what's going to happen. I'm sure we're going to see ballots with folks who, maybe just went right across the board and voted for the same person for every position. But that happens now, right? I mean, that happens on ballots, without ranked choice voting. People don't, follow the instructions, or they're confused. So again, I think it's just going to be constant education. This first year is going to be a learning curve, of course, and I think we're going to get there moving forward. But we're going to all work together. I think in a bipartisan manner to make sure that people are educated. That it's important for both sides and for everybody that people understand how to do this, because ultimately it does benefit them.
And Doug, I want to get your opinion. As you've said, you're never one to shy away from criticisms of the city's board of election when it's warranted, and you have been a part of the kind of ongoing early hiccup of the counting software that needs approval. How confident do you feel as the a co-chair of the state board of elections, who is very aware of some of the shortcomings that the city board of election has been accused of in the past, that they'll be able to implement this efficiently and with as minimal hiccups as possible? I guess keeping in mind that it kind of started with a little bit of a hiccup.
uh, Efficiently, I'll never be confident. And I think I've already mentioned that I'm not comfortable with their plan on the timing of counting the votes, but I'm confident that they are on top of the problem for getting an accurate count. But going to have to get used to the fact that if the runoff is triggered, in other words, if a candidate doesn't get 50% of the vote, we're not going to get the results under the current city plan until June 15th. And it doesn't have to be that way. There are other alternatives. But my problem with the city board is that once they get into a mindset of how they're going to do something, they zone out every other idea and don't consider it. And we went through this with ballot scanning. where they had this Rube Goldberg scheme for providing election night results, which resulted in error after error in the election night results. And it took 5 years to get them to come up with the current system that they have, which was a very logical system, and any outsider would have said that's how you should do it. And now we have very accurate and quick election night results. But it took them 5 years of their Rube Goldberg scheme before they came to actually introducing that scheme. And they're doing the same thing now with counting the ranked choice voting ballots. But the scheme will work. And if you're willing to wait until June 15th, you'll get the results. And I'd be happy to go into how you could do it differently if people want to get into those geeky details.
Well, I'm certainly interested, but I don't think we have enough time left on the panel. Actually, there's one other thing I wanted to ask Doug. It came up in a Q&A, and I admit I don't know for sure. It wasn't necessarily posed as a question. I guess I just wanted to see whether I want to get confirmation from you if this is true. I'm not sure if the scanners, if you fill out your ballot wrong and you accidentally rank two candidates the same rank, will the scanner reject your ballot and allow you to get a new one? Like, is the scanner sensitive enough for those for the ranking process?
Yeah. That particular example, the scanners will recognize. The election vendor for the city has proposed additional screens that would alert voters to undervote situations, but those could not be implemented in time for the June primary election. So that's for something down the road. But if you overvote, you will get a notice.
Well, I think that's a good thing to have in place, as well as for voters to be aware of, especially to know that if they do make a mistake, that they can get up to 2 more ballots to cast their vote, and after that, they can still cast an affidavit ballot. That's always an option as well. We're starting to run a little short on time. We're going to be wrapping up soon. I guess I just want to leave it with, any last thoughts that anyone has about ranked choice voting and, ways to make sure that it's rolled out and implemented as smoothly as possible, and that every voter uses it as much to their advantage as possible.
Well,
please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Morano. I want to say that, an important part of rolling it out is, as we focused on for the majority of this webinar, is education, right? And making people aware. And I just want to echo what my good friend Frank Morano had said before. Forums like this, the city and state should be applauded for doing this, because this is the type of forum that people need to be able to see and to learn and to know, what this new ranked choice voting does. That's going to be the important part of it. I think also, many of us can encourage candidates, not only on the local level, but you had 2 mayoral candidates on before talking about ranked choice voting, maybe encouraging those citywide candidates to start now talking about ranked choice voting to the voters. Whether that's in an official capacity of their campaign or just on the fly when they're talking to reporters or voters as they're campaigning in the neighborhood. But I think it should be in everybody's head why they're out there to talk about ranked choice voting. I think that's the best way to roll it out.
I would just add, in terms of final thoughts, that listening to Mr. Kellner, it's always interesting to note that nobody ever has criticism of the New York City Board of Elections more than a former commissioner of the New York City Board of Elections, irrespective of party. And it's something I've always gotten a kick out of. But I'll just say, one of my concerns is that the opponents of ranked choice voting will use any disaster scenario in any municipality that has ranked choice voting in the country as an argument against it. And I would caution New Yorkers not to be fooled by that. There was an op-ed in the New York Post saying, well, you know, if they institute ranked choice voting, we go forward with this, they're going to elect all sorts of people that are going to defund the police. Now, keep in mind, there's no evidence at all to suggest that, but you can always pick out an anecdotal example of some worst case scenario and say, you see, that's what's going to happen. I hope New Yorkers won't be fooled. And if people do like ranked choice voting in the primary, to me, the most confusing aspect of it is that we then switch to a whole different system for state primaries and for primaries that take place the very same day for other offices like district leader and DA. So I do hope that the substantial political apparatus that's watching this, club leaders, labor leaders, party leaders, politicians, everyone, if they like ranked choice voting, work on your city and state elected officials to get it implemented for state elections, work on your city and state elected officials to get it implemented for the general elections. And kudos to Congressman Richie Torres for slipping into HR 1, a provision that would have folks study ranked choice voting even on a national level. I came across recently a questionnaire that Assemblyman Cusick filled out in 2004. He was asked a question about instant runoff voting. His response was, I'm not familiar with instant runoff voting. Now, 17 years later, he's in a forum helping explain it to people. It goes to show you how far education on this issue has already come, and there's going to be a lot more to come. So don't let the adversaries who don't want electoral reform fool you. This is going to be a healthy reform for New Yorkers, and it's going to be an exciting reform that I think is going to sweep the nation in the years to come.
Frank, does that example show that I'm a slow learner? I don't.
And
Not even close.
And any final words to wrap us up, Doug, before we finish?
Only that I'm looking forward to this, and I'm very comfortable that it's going to be implemented successfully, and it's going to change New York politics for the better.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists today for coming on and chatting a little bit about ranked choice voting. I hope that this was a good experience for you, and I hope that our everyone who tuned in learned a little something and feels a little bit more confident about the June primaries and the new system that they're going to be taking part in. I'll turn it back over to my colleague Zach to take us out.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and to all of you, our great and distinguished panelists. We couldn't have done it without all of you. Let's keep the conversation going, even though we're running out of time today. We're back in, virtually at least, in Brooklyn on March 25th for the 5th and final installment of our Path to Ranked Choice Voting series. Another way you can stay in the loop with ranked choice voting is by going to our website at cityandstateny, like New York.com, to sign up for Campaign Confidential, the must-read newsletter. It comes out every Tuesday that my colleague Jeff Colden does. Has everything you want to know about the latest with the mayor's race, city council, borough presidents, and just the 2021 election cycle in general. Great read. And then, of course, on March 19th, we are talking affordable housing at our latest state legislative forum. Thanks so much to Spectrum. This has been a great event. We couldn't have done it without our great sponsor for helping us put it on. I'm Zach Williams, staff reporter at City and State. Catch you next time.